Right, okay, so what we're going to have is we have four speakers who are going to put across their perspectives of CCS in terms of the United Kingdom. We have Bryony Livesey from UKRI, followed by Olivia Powis from CCSA, then Clair Gough from who will be representing UKCCSRC, and finally Sanjay Mukherjee, who will be giving his perspective from the Energy Systems Catapult. Each speaker will talk for approximately 10 minutes. Rather than having a little Q&A after each speaker, I'm just going to get them all out of the way. And what I'll be doing is monitoring the Q&A box to just note down the questions, and then we'll drive the discussion from there. Now we've got plenty of people on in this particular channel, so I am expecting some good interaction from the audience, and hopefully it won't come down to just me asking the questions, because any questions I ask will require a calculator for the solution. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Bryony, who will be doing her short presentation. Bryony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm Bryony Livesey, and I lead the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge. And what I'd just like to do in this short session is take you through what the challenge is, what we're up to at the moment, and what's coming next. So on the next slide, please, we are focusing on decarbonising industry in the UK. Reasons for that are that decarbonising industry is quite difficult. It uses obviously a lot of power and massive amounts of heat. Many manufacturing processes produce CO2 as a natural part of the production process, so it's difficult to get rid of that CO2. And of course, decarbonising industry costs a lot, all of which leads to it being a massive challenge. But we're focusing on decarbonising industry in clusters, and the reason is that a lot of industrial emissions are located in quite small industrial regions of the UK. Next slide, please. So within the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge, our job is to decarbonise these industrial clusters, kickstart that process, not complete it, because ultimately the costs will run into the billions. But we're kickstarting the process and focusing on the major industrial regions of the UK where these massive amounts of CO2 are produced. And so what we have got is three major themes to the programme. Which we call deployment. This is the major infrastructure projects that we're building in each region. Cluster plans, which is about how that infrastructure can be used and what else is needed in the region. And then IDRIC, which is our research centre designed to look at what's needed within the clusters from a science and technology point of view. So the programme as a whole is about £500 million in total, of which 210 million of that is public money, and the rest comes from industry directly. So I'm just going to quickly take you through an example of the projects, and first of all, remind you of where they are. So the industrial clusters are situated around the UK. They're traditional industrial regions. The projects marked in green are cluster plan projects, which are looking at what is needed to decarbonise the region as a whole. And then the orange projects are the major deployment projects, which are about infrastructure. So if we move to our next slide. I've chosen the Northwest just as an example. So if you're not familiar with any of our cluster plan projects, this is an example. The others are similar to this in that they almost all have a very large hydrogen production element. They all have a large element of capturing CO2 and offshore storage. But taking the Northwest as an example, what we're doing, it's important to emphasize that everything in this program is being done at scale. So it's not a demonstration or a research program in any sense. This is all about the real large scale infrastructure. So if you look at the Northwest, right in the middle of this picture, we've got some hydrogen production facilities. And as part of producing hydrogen, we're going to be developing a pipeline coloured in orange on this picture. which is going to take the CO2 from the production process and also CO2 captured from other industries in the region and take that out for offshore long-term storage. And then in the black pipelines, you can see snaking all around parts of the northwest. We're going to be taking the hydrogen from that production facility and using it in various processes. So it could be used directly in industry. It could be stored temporarily to use later. It could be used for transport and many other purposes, as you're probably very well aware. So every program that we're funding has got this significant element of carbon capture and hydrogen. And it's probably also worth keeping in mind that a lot of our industrial clusters also have a major power element, so looking at decarbonised power production as well, and that's obviously an important element of how we decarbonise industry. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. If you haven't been following the UK story very closely for perhaps a year or so, it might come as a bit of a surprise that we've got these really major construction projects in their design stage and will soon be moving to delivery. So a lot has changed over the last couple of years. So when the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge kicked off in the middle of 2019, we had a government ambition of achieving the world's first net zero industrial cluster by 2040. And we still have that ambition, but as we've moved through 2020 and moving into the early parts of 2021, and now we've got the ambition of having 4 decarbonised clusters in place by 2030. And that is a massive change over a very short number of years. And clearly those decarbonised industrial clusters will be emerging from the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge. And you heard from Paul Monks about the cluster sequencing process and other things that are underway right now to support that in happening. So let me just move you on to where we're going next. So in terms of where we've got up to, in our deployment projects, we have got all of our projects underway now. So that's a fantastic achievement of itself. I know in the early part of the day, we were hearing about a number of projects which didn't really get ever started. So we have got to the fabulous milestone of starting all of the projects we intended to fund. They're all running now, and they will all finish between March 2023 and March 2024, and then move from the design and planning stage into the construction stage. And then all our cluster plan projects are underway as well. And what we're doing with those is trying to make sure that the regions recognise what infrastructure is coming, what value it might bring to their region, and then what else might they need. And all these plans are due to be completed by March 2023. And then the idea is that they will support future growth in the regions. They'll support attracting inward investment and many other things that each region will need to be heading towards being the first net zero cluster in the UK by 2040. There's a lot needs to happen by then, as we all know. And then, of course, we have our research centre, which launched from the 1st of April, and I'm hoping that the initial programme of work for the centre will be announced soon. We've moved so that all the projects are in the delivery phase. So we've done all the competition stages and the design of the competition moved into delivery. And so the key point from now on is that we actually have to deliver these projects, which is up to the projects themselves to do that. But, you know, they're all making great progress. And then what we have to do is make sure that our vision for the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge doesn't get lost along the way. So one of the things that's really important is that we wanted all elements of the programme to be proceeding at the same time so that we could get as much knowledge sharing and learning happening amongst all the strands, and that they could all support each other in a meaningful way. So we have got the real possibility for that to happen because all the work's in progress. And we have to try and make sure that we find a way to deliver all of that rather than just talk about delivering it. And then I think crucially, we have to plan to make sure that each of these industrial clusters delivers more than just a project. So I think it's pretty clear that future investment in these clusters is going to be on a massive scale wherever that investment comes from. We're going to need huge amounts of public support to make that happen. And so one of the things I'm particularly keen on, and I know our projects are too, is making sure that we are a real model of equality, diversity and inclusion, and that we can model to the public what exciting careers there will be in these industries and what we're actually doing to reduce carbon emissions in a way that the public is going to be excited about and supportive of. And we expect all of these regions to thrive as a result of decarbonisation rather than their industries disappear. And that obviously is really important for the people who live in those regions and for the nation as a whole. So we've got a lot left to deliver. We don't just sort of sit back and watch it happening. We have a big evaluation process conducted by external evaluators to make sure that some of the goals for the programme are actually tracked over time and that we are heading in the right direction. So we're in a very exciting stage. It's a little bit scary, lots to do, but that's all I was going to do by way of an introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bryony. Great introduction to what's going on at UKRI. So next I'll call Olivia Powis of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association to give her short introductory presentation. Olivia, over to you.
Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me today, and thanks, Bryony, for that, that introduction. Just a little bit about the CCSA. I'm Olivia Powis. I'm head of the UK office at the CCSA, which is a trade association representing the CCUS industry. And we work to assist and lobby for policy developments in the UK, EU and internationally towards a long-term regulatory and incentive framework for CCUS. We also help to raise awareness of CCUS, particularly demonstrating it as a vital tool in fighting climate change and delivering sustainable long-term growth. We focus on commercial scale projects and are technology neutral across industry, power, hydrogen, BECCS, stacks and different capture technologies, and have a range of members from across those industries and the supply chain. And we've got our website there if you want to find out more information. Next slide, please. So I will skip over some of the bits that have already mentioned, but just to cover CCUS and government strategy and its role in achieving net zero, a little bit on ambition and progress in the UK, outline what the opportunity for CCUS is for the UK and deployment, and then finally finishing with the investment model for CCUS in the UK. Thank you. So I will go over this very quickly because Bryony's just set it out, but obviously the 10-point plan last November introduced the ambition to capture 10 million tonnes of CO2 a year by 2030, which was very welcome. Doing this with the deployment of 4 clusters, 2 by the mid-2020s and another 2 by 2030. And alongside the total of $1 billion for the CCUS infrastructure fund. I will move on there because I think we've heard the background for that. But this was then followed by the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget advice soon after, where the balanced net zero pathway set out for the UK to capture 104 million tonnes of CO2 storage per annum by 2050. And so to set us on a trajectory to do this, looking at 22 million tonnes per year in 2030. So immediately we sort of moved from 10 million tonnes to 22 million tonnes. They also set out helpfully that CCS is a necessity and not an option for reaching net zero. and we needed accelerated action with the first cluster being deployed in the mid-2020s. And then the cluster sequencing process obviously was released in February, and we responded to that and came back. And then the government came back and said there would be at least 2 CCUS clusters in the mid-2020s. So helping us to move from just those initial 2 to then at least 2, and 4. Sorry, not at least 4, but at 4 by the late 2020s, with further clusters around 2030. And just setting out there in that, okay, sorry, just back on in that graph, the critical role that CCUS plays in reaching those harder to decarbonize sectors in clean hydrogen production, greenhouse gas removals, particularly in that heavy industry decarbonization, and providing flexible zero carbon power. So the opportunity of deploying CCUS in the UK obviously it plays a huge and significant role in meeting net zero, but also will help to create 10,000 new jobs and retain 50,000 plus jobs in industries such as steel, cement, refining, ceramics and glass. And I think the point to make here really is that these locations are in former industrial heartlands. So the deploying CCUS in the UK will play a significant role in the regions that have been earmarked for levelling up. So helping to sustain industries there and also create new jobs, as well as obviously meeting net zero. But also if we're able to deploy at scale and move quite quickly in the UK, we will then also build up the potential for additional jobs supporting exports and help position ourselves as a global leader in CCUS. And in terms of how we can do that, we're obviously blessed with geological assets, and that figure there shows that the UK has 1/3 of Europe's storage capacity and as much as the other EU member states combined. So we really have a significant opportunity here, both in terms of our geological assets, but also in terms of our experience in offshore infrastructure and skills and capacity there. So we do have a competitive advantage and could become a global leader in CCUS, low carbon hydrogen production and industrial decarbonisation. And if we can do that and deploy at scale and deploy early and set ourselves out as a leader, we can capture a significant share of the global CCUS market, which is estimated to be around 4.3 billion per year from exports by 2050. So there really is huge opportunity in the UK, and I think we're well positioned both in terms of skills and assets to be able to really take advantage of this and set ourselves up to be a global leader and also ahead of COP to really help lead the way. I won't spend too much on this because I think this is being covered and discussed from other speakers, but we have the cluster sequencing program in the UK to help deploy CCUS, and so we're now at the stage where we're looking, the clusters have submitted, and we're anticipating the announcement of the sequencing from the 25th of October. So this is really, it's moving fast, and it's very welcome in terms of moving the industry forward. It's a challenging timeline, and it's a timeline that's kind of progressing at the same time as we're still, as an industry and with government, working on finalising business models, looking at the regulatory regime and the investment that will need to go with that. So a lot of this work is having to happen concurrently instead of sequentially. So there's a huge amount of development and deployment and investment required, whilst continuing to work on all these areas to help build up this industry and deploy at scale. throughout the 2020s. So a lot of these, all these clusters are now working very hard in terms of both their bids, but also in terms of helping to set the framework for CCUS to ensure that it can be a successful industry. Next slide, please. Investing in CCUS to enable deployment. So just to point here, the CCSA commissioned economic analysis from AFRY and Cambridge Econometrics to help us and to help Treasury decision making on funding support for CCUS. And so this study set out the funding requirements to deploy CCUS in the 2020s to meet those two 2030 target scenarios. So both the 10-point plan scenario of 10 million tonnes per year and the CCC's net zero pathway of 22 million tonnes per year, and looked at the economic impact of CCUS investment in the 2020s, both in terms of creation of net jobs, but also in terms of GDP growth. The study also looked at the analysis of lessons learned from government support from offshore wind deployment. And we heard just from the couple of speakers ago to how successful offshore wind has been. And so it's been an important kind of study to look at those areas, what worked, what wasn't successful, and what can we replicate in this industry to ensure that we can deploy quickly and at scale. And so from this, the CCSA is proposing that the Treasury use the spending review to introduce a longer term funding mechanism for CCUS between now and 2030, similar to the levy control framework, to help provide certainty for the industry to know that it won't only be those first two clusters and then the next two, but it will continue to deploy throughout the 2020s and 2030s, so that the supply chain can gear up and the industry can have some certainty of what more will be coming down the line. And obviously this will help and play a significant role in the government facilitating a green economic recovery by delivering critical net zero infrastructure, creating new jobs and opportunities in those regions earmarked for levelling up, and helping the UK to become an international leader in developing and exporting green technology. And my last slide. So really just to highlight those points there from the UK CCUS ambition, I think we've come a long way. There's an awful lot of activity going on, but we don't want to sort of become complacent and shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we need to be moving towards that 22 million tonne target per year by 2030 if we're really to meet those net zero targets. And so there, in terms of the cluster sequencing, we need to keep momentum going, both for track 1, phase 1 and 2, but also track 2 to enable investment decisions from 2022 and to deliver at scale throughout the 2030s. And continue to work with government, who've done a huge amount of, continue to issue consultations and doing a huge amount of work in this area, but good progress on transport and storage, flexible power industry, and now the hydrogen strategy, and we need to accelerate on greenhouse gas removals, and really to secure that that long-term delivery and the affordability envelope for CCUS going forwards beyond the next few years. I think I'll stop there, and we can obviously take questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia. That's very, very helpful to add to the discussion. Next, I'll call on Clair Gough, who's from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester. Clair, over to you.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Richard. Yes, so I'm going to, John's asked me to talk about public attitudes to CCS in the UK, which I'll try to do. So my first slide has next slide has the plan. So I was going to give you a little bit of background of what's going on in the national context, and then talk more about what's happening in the clusters and the recent BEIS CCUS public dialogue, and then some thoughts about looking forward in terms of securing support from wider publics and clusters and beyond. And then I've moved to the end a little snapshot of the academic literature, and depending on how much time we've got. So next slide, the national context. So There's been a large amount of academic research on in this field over the last 20 years, starting with some focus groups that we did talking when people had really not heard of CCS at all. It was very, very early days, talking about it in general, and the kind of research body has massively grown since that time. There's two broad ways of reviewing public attitudes. Firstly, surveys, which quite often the CCS component of that is part of a wider survey talking about energy or climate change or various aspects of the of different technologies or kind of different visions of the future. And quite often those don't provide a lot of information about CCS, but it does give you a snapshot of how much people have heard of it and what the levels of knowledge of that are. And I've listed a few examples there. The exception to this is David Reiner's work in Cambridge, who's produced some really great longitudinal surveys specifically focusing on CCS, so we can see how knowledge is expanding or not, as the case may be, around CCS in the UK. And then there's more discursive methods, which include approaches such as focus groups, citizen panels, which allow you much more in-depth discussion. And both of these approaches have a really useful role to play. But with those discursive methods, obviously you can't access as many people in one shot, but it does allow you to build up a better understanding of how opinions form, why people hold different opinions, and what really underlines people's feeling. And it also gives you the opportunity to provide information, which is really useful when you're talking about a technology that's not very well known in the wider discourse. And from this body of research, we see that there's multiple factors that shape how people view CCS, and the responses are shaped by the kind of geographical context and specifics within that geography and culture, how it's framed, trust in who's presenting the data, who's responsible for deployment, who's pushing the technology, and of course wider issues around attitudes people have towards climate change, climate policy, and the underpinning values on that. So lots of factors which shape how people view CCS. So moving on to the kind of results across the national context. So we've got a few surveys that I wanted to just flag up. There's others as well. There's a really useful one not listed here from ScienceWise in 2019 on public attitudes to clean growth, which has provided a really extensive review of some of the surveys of opinion and different kind of research in that field, which would be really good. I'd urge you to have a look at. That's really useful. The Bayes Climate Change and Net Zero Public Awareness and Perception Survey, which is quite a large survey, talking about people's attitudes to ways of reaching net zero. Very little on CCS in there, really summed up with a kind of broad statement around half the participants believe that we should be pursuing an equal mix of technology and lifestyle changes. So this kind of view of demand and supply side measures. Then the Bayes Net Zero Public Dialogue, both of these were produced in 2020, I think, which was a more discursive approach, holding online workshops with around 100 participants. Again, very little information provided on CCS, a lot of talk around diets and travel, but not so much on CCS, and certainly none of the detail of the role that CCS could play. And people saw it as desirable and acceptable, but very little understood. And then the Climate Assembly UK is a third example I've picked, which is perhaps the most well known. And again, CCS was only presented in the context of electricity supply. At the end of the assembly, participants were asked what they wanted to know more about coming out of it, and CCS came across very strongly as one of those areas. And I think people felt they had more questions than answers around CCS. So with that context in mind, in terms of what the Climate Assembly participants said about CCS, they raised concerns around leakage and safety, particularly during the transport and storage phases of CCS, concerns around it continuing the use of fossil fuels, as we've talked about this morning already, and the preference for other solutions expressed, renewable energy, etc. And similarly with greenhouse gas removal, even less time focused to the kind of CCS applications of that, with very similar responses in terms of preferring what's perceived as natural climate solutions. And I don't want to kind of talk about that right now, because that's obviously a massive area, but this kind of dichotomy between so-called technology and natural solutions is clearly was playing there. Next slide, please. So coming on to the clusters to kind of extend from what Bryony's already introduced really well. So we've got lots of diverse applications we've been hearing about this morning. We shouldn't be seeing CCS as a single thing against which we want to review public opinion. It affects lots of different industries and applications. With hydrogen, it can have consequences for heat and transport. And then we've also got greenhouse gas removal, as I've mentioned, and all of those things will bring different nuances and inspire different responses. Against the backdrop of a growing climate emergency, the whole dialogue moving towards net zero, as we talk about COP26, certainly brings climate policy and technology into the news much more. Recent weather events, all of these things kind of inform the recognition of a need for decarbonisation, which will also in turn affect how people view technologies such as CCS. Advantages in terms of the regions, the clusters that CCS can bring in terms of jobs and local economies, and how that importance that is to those local communities in a kind of post-industrial or industrial landscape, as we've already mentioned. And opportunities for UK to become a global leader is also plays into that narrative. And I think it's also been shown that it's really important, as Bryony's set out, that the cluster plans are developed collaboratively with industry, with the local enterprise partnerships in the regions and local authorities, which enable it to promote regional benefits, but also that kind of combined funding between governance and industry is really important to how it's viewed. So really important, in the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Bay CCUS public dialogue. So this is a really important publication that came out in July this year. So I wasn't involved directly in the actual kind of fieldwork for this, but if you read through the report, there's a very extensive report of what the reactions were. And what's really important about this study is it's the first kind of proper discursive approach in the within the clusters and talking in relation to the actual planned project. So there's been quite a lot of work done in different regions previously, but this is the first one that kind of links to projects on the ground, so really useful. Overall, the study, so they looked at 5 locations, including one which is not part of the clusters, to have a sort of control view of people who are not likely to be host communities for CCS projects. Overall, found broad support for CCS, but that support conditional on its cost effectiveness and its perceived effectiveness to reduce CO2, alongside safety in storage and transport, as echoed in the Climate Assembly results. A few participants remain strongly opposed to CCUS throughout the process. So in each region, there was a series of workshops held and kind of building up more knowledge and discussion around it, and showed how kind of views changed during that process as participants learned more about CCS, but there were some that remained opposed. I think primarily that was around arguments that we've heard already about perpetuating the fossil fuel industry. And then in relation to the potential for CCS to sustain jobs, again, kind of different responses in different regions, which I think is really interesting. Looking forward to unpacking that a bit more when I can kind of get into the report in a bit more detail. Most positive responses in Aberdeen and Teesside, which are arguably the areas where it's kind of most advanced. The CCS is probably best well known, and more scepticism in the South Wales and Liverpool regions. For different reasons, I think. In South Wales, it's concern around maintaining the viability of the steel industry. I think in Liverpool, that's perhaps a more locational effect, where they were actually speaking to people in Liverpool centre, and it was a concern around, will these jobs come to Liverpool or will they be in the wider northwest region? So slightly different reasons for those levels of scepticism. Overall, this study found that participants were more comfortable with the kind of national idea of pursuit of CCS than necessarily living close by to it. So that's something that useful to unpack further. And if we go to the next slide, part of this process, participants were asked to develop their set of criteria to guide how we should implement CCS. And I think this slide, if any, is perhaps the most important of what I've got to present, because I think it really shows some of the kind of guiding principles by which how we should pursue CCS, and also the kind of this is a little snapshot into kind of broader public opinion. If I come into the next slide, just looking forward very quickly where my time is running out, I think the really important thing to think about when we're talking about public attitudes is there's no one size fits all. There's no single public response. We're talking about multiple scales of deployment, different contexts, application in different systems, with different communities, different publics at different scales, and a variety of other stakeholders. So it's not just the general public. There's also the role of influential NGOs, whose voice is very important. But also the role of other people within the system matters, how technology advocates behave, who those advocates are, who the developers are, and our own role as academics and experts is important there. Multiple different dimensions of public acceptance in terms of how the technology is governed. We haven't really mentioned just transitions. There's more to talk about that. Sorry, I'm rushing through this really now. I can see Richard looming over me. So there's a lot. How it is deployed becomes really important in what we look at, and then the services that CCS provides are as important as the technology, if anything more important. So in terms of CCS providing energy services and hydrogen, how people heat their homes and drive their vehicles is perhaps more important than thinking about technology itself. And then when we come to climate services such as greenhouse gas removal, this is a very, very new area. There's lots of work to be done on this around DACs and BECS in particular, how it's going to be regulated, who pays, balancing the different trade-offs. And then my summary slide, almost my final slide, just to say that so far it's been presented in very general terms. The context is very crucial. A quick flag about the work of IDRIC, the work programme about to be announced, as Bryony said. So there will be lots more work on the social science side of this, looking at skills and geography, extending our work on social licence that we've been doing within the UKCCS Research Centre, and the kind of network extending. And then I was just going to leave you with my snapshot of academic research, which, as predicted, I didn't have time to run through, but that's just some of the work that's been done in this space by myself and various colleagues in other institutions as well. So I'll just leave that up very briefly before I get moved on. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Claire. In my early days, when I started my PhD, I actually did public attitudes to waste and recycling, and the amount of interest that generated from the public just on when their bins were being collected. I mean, this dimensions above this, so very interesting. Lots to unpack in here. That was great. Thank you. Okay, we'll call on Sanjay from the Energy Systems Catapult.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank UKCCSRC and Professor John Gibbons for this wonderful opportunity. And I'll talk about ESC's view, Energy System Catapult's view on the role of CCS for achieving net zero in the UK by 2050. Next slide, please. So before I jump into that, I would like to give a brief introduction about the Catapult Network and Energy Systems Catapult. So there are 9 catapults in the Catapult Network, which are spread all over the UK, as you can see in the map here on the slide. And the catapults are independent from the government, and they are not for-profit entities. And these catapults are actually funded by Innovate UK. And their main purpose is to support innovation by bridging the gap between stakeholders within the UK and also globally. So we do work with academia, government, and the industrial sector. And the ESC, or Energy Systems Catapult, has its main hubs in Birmingham and Derby, where we have over 200 innovation experts. And our mission is to drive innovation at the pace and scale needed to achieve a low carbon energy system whilst maximizing UK productivity. And it is also to accelerate transformation of UK energy system and help UK businesses and companies capture the opportunity of clean growth. So our aim is informed by and supported by UK's industrial strategy, Clean Growth Strategy, and Climate Change Act. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, that our work include advising companies and government on the most important areas to innovate, such as technology, policy, and in the most recent years, exploring the societal behavior to reduce carbon emissions. And we use a group of tools to do that, but central to all those tools is ESME, which you can see here on the slide. And this was developed by ETI, and it is fairly popular amongst industry and base and deck. And ESME models look at whole system approach. So it looks at power, heat, transport, industry, and infrastructure. So it looks at demands and the generation from all energy services, then produce a technology roadmap, use different energy resources, and combine all those to get energy system pathways to achieve desired objective for the UK energy system. So the way it works is we provide ESME the problem, such as satisfy a demand for the lowest cost using a list of technology resources while delivering the net zero or whatever the carbon mitigation targets are for a certain year. And of course, we don't really know what the cost of things will be in the future, but that means that we can model the things probabilistically using a range of cost, and this range also applies to anything like the bill rates for the technologies or the resource quantities that we have available. And this model actually helps us to see the key technologies that are always get deployed and which are robust to changes in cost or any other changes. It also shows us the marginal technologies which appear in a small number of very particular scenarios. So in our ESME models, we use two approaches. One is Clockwork and Patchwork. In Clockwork, we use more centralized decision-making with a national strategy. And Clockwork is a well-coordinated, centrally planned long-term energy infrastructure. There are more technologies available in the Clockwork scenario. It uses negative emissions to compensate for the residual emissions. In the Patchwork scenario, we look at a series of distinct regional energy strategies, which are eventually integrated by central government. And the Patchwork is more decentralized as compared to the Clockwork. And there are greater roles for renewables in Patchwork. In Patchwork, we see a lot of societal changes to reduce emissions, which means comparatively less reliability on negative emission technologies, such as BECCS or DACs. So the societal changes in Patchwork reduces the need for offsets. So here on this slide, you can see the carbon emissions from 2015. And then we apply the Clockwork and Patchwork scenarios to achieve the net zero targets by 2050. And you will see that in the industry and transport and aviation or land use sector, the Clockwork allows you to emit slightly more CO2 than the Patchwork. And the reason behind this is that Clockwork can offset those additional emissions by applying DACs and BECCS technologies, whereas the Patchwork tries to reduce the emissions with societal changes like changing your food behavior or dietary behavior, and then looking at more land-based carbon mitigation technologies. Yeah, so here we have the results from our ESME model. And here we can see here that the hydrogen economy needed for up to 250 terawatt hour per year, that is for the year 2050. And this is close to the electricity demand today. And we can see that in the Clockwork analysis, a majority of this hydrogen will be provided by SMR plus CCS and supplemented by BECCS. whereas in the patchwork analysis, we have more contribution from electrolysis, which will be supplemented by BECCS. Again, then we compare both the scenarios in terms of CO2 capture, and we see that in Clockwork scenario, we have around 170 megatons of CO2 capture per year by the year 2050, whereas the patchwork is only 77 million tons. And most of this CO2 capture in the Clockwork scenario is dominated by hydrogen production using SMR, CCS, and BECCS, followed by DAC and industrial CCUS. Whereas in the patchwork, we see that the carbon capture is dominated by hydrogen production by BECCS, followed by gas-based gasifications. So we, in both these slides, you can see that CCS clearly has a very important role to play in achieving net zero by 2050. So apart from the model, we have also published, the output from the model can be found on our website. And apart from that, we also have published a work on innovating to net zero. And this was published last year, which looks at the scenarios or the solutions to get to net zero by 2050. And it looks at different options. So CCS is not the only option to decarbonize the sector or the UK economy. There are different other options. And this report gives a very good balance between, or explanation of what sort of mitigation will be used to get the net zero targets. Next slide, please. I will not delve into the details of the report, but I will highlight the key takeaways from this report. And the first one is that CCS and BECCS is must to produce hydrogen and offset residual emission to get to net zero in the UK. And we need to support innovation and deployment of CCS, develop funding mechanism, construct transport and storage infrastructure. And we cannot decarbonize industries without CCS. You can see that 28 billion tons of CO2 will be captured from industries only by 2050 in our Clockwork scenario. And in the power sector, we have noticed that the model predicts that around 6 gigawatt of CCGT with CCS will be required to provide flexible power generation. And the majority of the contribution will be from renewables in the power sector. But CCGTs and CCS does have some role to play power sector as well. And 22 gigawatt of the power will be coming from hydrogen turbines. And this hydrogen will again can come from SMR, where we are using CCS or the BECCS plants. Next slide, please. So we are also involved on the industrial cluster projects. So we are part of the SNZR Phase 2 project and the South Wales Industrial Cluster. And in both these projects, we'll be looking at developing infrastructure and cluster level energy models. So I believe we'll get to hear about these projects a lot during this conference. So I'll not go into detail, but I'll answer any questions if there are any on these projects. So here, I'll end here, and thanks again for the opportunity, and I look forward to the questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sanjay. And obviously, thank you to all of our panelists for getting the scene nicely set. So now the work begins. We have to start looking at some of the questions that are coming in. So the Q&A box is open. So the first question is from Ben Stewart, and he put it in around about the time that Olivia was talking. So I'll go to Olivia first, but by all means, one of the other panel members chip in if you have your own opinion. Is the 3-point scenario the result of prohibiting onshore sequestration? I'm not a geologist, so I don't even know what that means. So over to the panelists. Is the 3-point scenario the result of prohibiting onshore sequestration?
I'm not sure what you mean by the 0.3 scenario. Sorry, is that, are you able to clarify, Ben?
Yeah, my question was point 3 on your slide said the UK had 30% of the European storage capacity, but I assume that's because there is no onshore storage evaluated in Europe. That's purely an offshore storage capacity.
Yeah, that was looking at offshore storage.
We'll follow that one up with the question of, did the GDP study include examination of impact on inflation and cost of living?
Yes, so this one is me as well. It looked at, yes, in short. So it assumed that all private sector investment would be financed through loans that would be paid back over a 10-year period, and that public investment would be financed through a small increase in tax rates. And the investment costs for transmission and distribution would be shared between CCUS users in proportion to the levels of emissions captured, transported and stored. And so it also, the jobs created looked at the additional jobs in the UK compared to the baseline, and looked at that once reflected in higher debt levels, once the debt had been repaid, but there were still higher levels of employment persisting of that point. So it also looked at the impact in terms of potential price increases in electricity and gas bills, in terms of cost of living as well. So yes, it considered across the board, and with actually sort of relatively conservative in terms of our assumptions. It didn't want to overinflate.
Okay, it's still sticking with you as I think as first expert, Olivia. So Ian McKinley's asked a question. I'm going to paraphrase it a little, and the question, as I paraphrase it, would be: what about the UK's potential in terms of overseas territories for storage? I assume that means, yeah.
Yes, I saw this one. It's obviously a valid point. I mean, I think we've looked at the storage capacity sort of based around the geography around the UK, because obviously we're looking at transport and storage networks, and that storage capacity. But yes, I mean that's a valid point there too.
Okay. And did the economic study evaluate the remediation cost of bad decisions? With, you know, as these things happen when we make decisions and find out they don't work, is there any kind of risk or economic impact of that considered in your costings?
We didn't specifically look at bad decisions with respect to technology options, but I suppose what we did, back to that point, that it was conservative estimates. So we would hope that, you know, within that would be covered. And the way that the model was set out, we had to make made a significant number of assumptions, and so we can flex the model up and down depending on which costs would increase and decrease. So yeah, we didn't specifically look at a bad decision with respect to technology options, but yeah, I would think that over the whole, looking over the spectrum of what we looked at in terms of investment, then that would be consumed within
that. Question now for Claire. In the studies where you've examined the impact of CCS on the communities that might be affected by their proximity, what about rural and urban awareness? And I guess that, so the question is, did the study evaluate rural and urban awareness and perceptions?
So I think as far as I'm aware, none of the studies I talked about from Bayes did that, and the Climate Assembly also did not do that, although the participants will have been drawn from a kind of broad mix of demographics and where they live. I think we've done a little bit of work on kind of pipeline routings and things, which is where rural communities will be particularly relevant. But I don't think that explicit distinction has been made yet, but that obviously is all part of the kind of nuances and part of not seeing the public as a single unified being, I think.
I think you've answered answered the next question as well. Concerns. Were the people surveyed aware of the risks and environmental impacts?
Of other, I saw that that's about other technologies, I think, was that question. I think again, that depends on the study. I think the Climate Assembly did go into a fair amount of detail of a variety of approaches. I think the cluster study from Bayes will have had much less detail on other approaches on the grounds that they would be more familiar to participants. I think that raises a really important point about how we need to assess and evaluate a range of technologies along the same grounds on the level playing field. And I think quite often with CCS and BECCS in particular, in terms of life cycle emissions, it's held to a higher standard, and that's not to kind of bring that standard down to the level of other technologies, but to take everything up to that higher standard. And particularly when we're talking about net zero, and we're all driving towards that, that kind of really exposes what we're really heading for with everything. So I think, yeah, I think I would argue for always having a level playing field in terms of holding technologies to account, if you like.
No, I'm going to use chair's privilege here. Have you seen any examples of misinformation, what Trump likes to call fake news or anything like that? Because if you look at other technologies like nuclear or waste incineration, you start to get the sort of the anti-lobby with quite dubious data. Has anything started to happen like this around carbon capture and storage, or is it still early days? I've
not seen anything, I must admit. I think on the kind of, in terms of BECCS, on the kind of biomass side, there's quite an active community of, there's quite an active dialogue around biomass, not necessarily specifically in relation to CCS, which has a whole tranche of opinions. There's been some studies on social media and Twitter which might pick up that sort of thing, but the people who tend to be active on Twitter around CCS and BECCS are kind of elites, almost, as you would call them, rather than kind of it being in the kind of wider narrative, I think. So I haven't seen anything as yet.
Okay, good.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're out of the questions that were asked during the presentation. So the next question comes from Richard Smith of Howden. So this is open to the panel. It's a long question. So I think if I ask just the first part, I think that explains the rest. What confidence can be obtained to secure industrial support? And this is something that's quite a hot topic for CCUS initiatives, projects and competitions. And then he goes on to say about some of the difficulties that there have been in engagement and getting with industry and getting funding to flow from there. So I'll open that one up to the panel. If nobody jumps in, I'll volunteer someone.
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess my response would be that we're already seeing a huge change in attitudes from industry. I think the UK's moved on a tremendous amount over the last 5 years. And I think there are two indications of this. I think, first of all, decarbonising clusters seems to be proving quite a useful approach, because we've got whole communities of different industries working together to understand what the infrastructure is going to deliver to them as a whole, and they're all lobbying for that infrastructure to be in place, and I think that's tremendously positive. And then we can see that the industries themselves have invested in this program. So in a time of COVID, people have all gone to their boards and they've got several tens of millions of pounds to put into this program. Quite a significant number of companies have invested without getting any corresponding government funding to match their investment, because they were so keen to be involved. And I think we are seeing a lot of enthusiasm from industry that we hadn't really seen in the past. That's my view anyway.
Does it place a lot of pressure on the clusters? Because it's interesting to know that every speaker has mentioned the clusters, and we're all putting a lot of emphasis on them. And I agree, it's certainly one of the ways in which industry can get involved on their terms. But are we placing a lot of pressure on them to deliver in that case?
I think there are a lot of people watching to make sure that it will be successful, yes. But I think the advantages probably outweigh the pressures. And I think the most important thing is that those pressures are exerted in the right place to make sure that the infrastructure is right for the region. So we would want to see that pressure coming anyway.
Yes, indeed.
So there's a lot of industries, we want to make sure this pipeline goes past our front door, is the sort of thing that we've been seeing, as the program's developed. And I think that's a very positive move.
Okay, there's another open question to the panel from Ben. How much does the comparative cost of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen have to drop to be commercial or commercially viable, I guess, without tax or subsidy support?
Well, CCUS is obviously considered in our model, but since the contribution on the U part is not very significant, so I've not noticed it in the results that I've seen in ESME. But ESME does include hundreds of technologies, and I'm sure that ESME has used CCUS as well. But yeah, it's obviously one of the options that we look at ESME. But since the contribution is not significant, so I've not presented it in the presentation here. But yeah, I'll look into it and I'll find what role it has.
Yeah. One from me now to you. I was interested to see that the differences in results in terms of hydrogen between the Clockwork and the Patchwork model. Researchers in hydrogen, and it's interesting that I think it was the Clockwork, I'll probably get the wrong way around. The Clockwork said it was about natural gas cracking and then carbon capture, and then the Patchwork said that it was about electrolysis, and those are very different things. So I'm interested to see why you think you got such different results.
All right. Well, in the Patchwork, we what the tool tries is to reduce the emissions within the region. So it's more decentralized scenario or approach. So it first of all tries to reduce the emissions within the region. And if you look at the SMR with CCS, then we use a capture rate of 95% over there, which means there will be residual emissions. And these residual emissions may not be offset by other available technologies to the region. So that's why it tries to switch to the next best low carbon option for producing hydrogen, and which in this case is electrolysis. But if we get a 99% CO2 capture rate from any capture technologies, then I think that we'll have more share of SMR with CCS in the Patchwork as well.
Okay, good, thanks. This one may be the last question. I think the whole panel can probably have a go at it, and I think it's quite relevant. So Ben has said, how do you predict the price increase in energy when the current increase predictions have gone horribly wrong? So I guess it's a question about confidence in modeling or future trends. So does anyone want to weigh in on that one?
Well, the energy prices that we use in our models, it comes from a lot of documents which are published by BASE and other government organizations. So since I don't run the model, I'm just a user of the outputs that the model produce. So, but I know the lot of outputs come from the published work, which are from the BASE documents, and so we do have confidence on the prices that we get from there.
Bryony, Olivia, any comment on that?
I think same as Sanjay. So we looked at various different numbers of sources, but also, as I said, it was in our sensitivity analysis. So we mapped a whole range across differences in electricity and gas prices, and the model can flex to adapt to that. So we've just had to plan for different prices there.
Yeah, we also do have a range of energy prices, and we try to capture the upper and the lower limit of the energy all the fluctuations.
I think that's it. I think we're out of time on the session. If I take another question, we're going to roll over. So my great thanks to all of the panel members, and obviously to everybody. We've had quite a lot. We've had over 80 people involved on this particular session. So my thanks to everybody for contributing and keeping this a nice lively debate, albeit on a screen being typed in. And the rest of the day's program is continuing. So thank you very much. And this session is now closed.